Hello, it's Mrs. Wallace, just giving you a short video clip about economic systems. So this is just a little bit of a brief introduction to some of the topics that are in your textbook about economic systems. We looked at a few different types of economic systems. You know, most countries of the world really have a mixed economic system, not quite purely market, not quite purely command, but somewhere in the middle. But economic systems from society to society can differ a great deal. One of the ways in which economic systems might differ is how much they really rely on markets and prices in decision making. So, you know, kind of deciding who produces, what gets produced rather in the society, how much, you know, markets and prices are really determining that. Another big difference in market versus command-based systems includes the degree of government, control and government intervention. A couple of things about economic systems. Systems are going to answer largely the three questions that we see on the top. What goods and services will be produced? Any economic system is going to be answering that question. How will the goods and services be produced? So, in what way do the goods and services actually get produced? And who will get the goods and services? That becomes a really significant question that has to do with the distribution of goods or the allocation of goods. How will, who gets what ultimately be decided? Some additional questions economic systems might also answer. How will the system accommodate a change? So as there is either growth or perhaps some sort of change, consumer taste change, so demand might change. What happens when the system sees change? How does it accommodate that change? And how will the system promote progress? In other words, how will the economic system promote some degree of economic growth? And each type of economic system, really answers the same exact question. So even a pure command-based system or a pure market system, which are kind of these like theoretical models that we look at, for the most part, each one of those models will answer these specific questions. In a free market model, a pure capitalist model, so it's maybe not exactly what Adam Smith was addressing, but for the most part in his book, The Wealth of Nations, he is going to advocate for what is largely a pure market model. A couple of things about the pure market model, and we do use this in econ a lot. We will use the perfectly competitive or pure market model quite a bit as a theoretical model, just kind of almost assuming that there is a great deal of competition and a great deal of small firms that are largely producing a product that's very similar. A few things about the pure capitalist model. First of all, the role for the government is very, very small. Generally, we refer to this as laissez-faire. And the power of the government is basically present for a few, specific reasons. One, and this is definitely something to note, the role of government would be present to protect private property. Something that a market economy needs is access to private property. And so the rule of law is basically to protect private property. A second, kind of component of that and kind of related is providing a legal environment for contract enforcement. So if there's some sort of arrangement about one's property, some type of agreement, then that legal environment is created so those contracts can be enforced. In a market-based system, we suggest that consumers and producers interact in markets that buy and sell. So this is going to be very, very much kind of related to supply and demand that we've been looking at in class, and it's prices that act as signals to dictate the value of goods in the market. Okay, so consumers are always looking at prices. If prices go too high, consumers might hold back some of their purchases, and the opposite is the case for producers. So as prices shift and change, we see consumers and producers kind of interacting regarding those prices. A command-based system, which is kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum. If a market system, everything about the market-based system is, connected to, who decides what to produce, in what way are things produced, the market is going to determine those things, either consumers or producers. In a command-based system is largely controlled by a government that makes its control evident, oftentimes in a central plan, oftentimes years in advance, such as like a 5-year plan where the government is going to dictate, essentially what the society will produce, how it will be produced, and who will get what. All of those essential questions in a command-based system, are answered by the government. Decisions may be made by a central planning board, on behalf of the government. And this includes all prices, all output decisions. So in, for example, the former Soviet Union, where communism existed, perhaps under, say, Joseph Stalin, where there was a series of 5-year plans, there was an effort to try to create an entire economy so that the government could determine ahead of time, who would be producing. There was kind of collective farming, how much would be produced by different groups of people, and what that production and how it would get distributed. So there's a great deal of the decision-making really falling into the hands of the government. There are a few societies today that largely are still command-based, Cuba becoming less and less so, perhaps North Korea, a few other societies too. Even in North Korea, there is some smuggled goods. There's a strong underground economy. So it's not 100% command-based, but still largely a command-based system. Many societies are what we would call a mixed market economy or a mixed economy. It's quite a bit of decentralized decision-making by stakeholders in the market, in other words, consumers and producers, but there's some government control or involvement. There might be some government ownership of firms. So, for example, healthcare or other, in some mixed economies, there might be some government ownership, some state businesses or whichever. But there's also a great deal of likelihood, some government regulations. So some oversight of, in particular, firms and consumers, where the rules of the market might be set up by the government. There's a great deal of variety in terms of the role of the government. We saw that in class with, China and Denmark, for example, both being largely, mixed economies, but very, very different. And in any type of market economy, private markets are the dominant force, and there's private ownership of at least most resources. So when we say private ownership, we're talking about, individuals owning a business, being able to make decisions about that business, being able to, sell, consumers being able to freely buy. When it comes to the government role that economies might have in a mixed economic, system, we have a variety of things. It might be the protection of property, could also be the offering of some, social safety net types of programs. It might be completely subsidizing a particular area like higher education, regulations and government incentives. There's a variety of different roles that the government might play. Regulations could include things like, enacting minimum wage laws or whatnot. We did look at the circular flow model in class. So just to remind you a little bit on both, this is a very simplified model of circular flow. And for the most part, this becomes a topic to know inside and out for the AP exam. But largely, we're looking at two markets, the product market and the resource market. Remember, in the product market, businesses are selling goods and services, and households are buying those goods and services. They're paying in the form of consumer expenditures, money that we refer to as spending, but consumption expenditures. And then firms are getting that in revenues. Okay, so Businesses are earning revenues. Consumers are spending money in the product market. Households and consumers are on the demand side. Businesses, firms are on the supply side. In the case of the resource market, it was a little bit more complicated. The resource market includes things like land, labor, and capital. Those are things that businesses need, so businesses will spend money in the resource market in the form of costs to access what ultimately households are going to be giving, which is land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, right? Households rent land, might offer wages, labor for wages. Households are also investing in capital. So firms are able to borrow money and buy things or have access to maybe through speculation and other types of finance. Businesses are accessing funds to purchase or rent capital. That resource is coming from households. So households are kind of the place where all of the resources are coming from. Businesses are purchasing those resources. And the resource market, just like the product market, has a demand and a supply side. Businesses are on the demand side in this case because they're looking for resources. They're demanding labor, for example, and households are supplying labor in the resource market. Okay, and we look at both of these markets in the circular flow system. Remember that in some cases, we're actually looking at dollars moving around the circular flow and that they're connected. So the money that firms are getting as revenue, ultimately that same money is being spent as costs in the resource market. Okay, so we can kind of see the way in which revenues turn to costs, how households essentially are going to receive some monies from business, and how households will spend some of that money, back in business. And of course, there's a lot of other segments of the economy, but for our purposes here, we get a chance to see the movement between the product and the resource market in the way in which businesses and households interact. So some of the characteristics of a pure market system, and this kind of fits with Adam Smith's model, but it also is going to fit with a model that we're going to be looking at in class, which is really a perfectly competitive or pure market model. There is private property. That is a really significant characteristic of a market system, even for mixed economies that are largely market-based, like the U.S., access to private property. And of course, that private property is protected by a government rule of law. We also have free enterprise and free choice. So this is saying, like, in the role of firms being able to decide what products to sell, businesses have a great deal of free range in deciding what products they'll sell, how they make those products, and what ways they'll innovate those products. Those are free choices, that businesses get to make. They own, in a sense, their property to be able to make decisions about it. Consumers also are able to make choices. There is a great deal of self-interest that is manifest in the market system. This kind of links back to Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand. If every single individual kind of follows their self-interest, basically, people following their utility and firms maximizing profit, following that degree of self-interest makes everyone better off in the market. Society sees kind of an allocatively efficient quantity that might be good for the entire economy. Competition is another feature. Competition is something that we look at within a market model. It's competition with other businesses that helps keep prices low. Without competition, one business might become like a consolidation of power and ultimately set a really high price. Even competition amongst consumers is also helpful in a market. Prices are the signals which are essentially kind of creating a little bit of the communication between consumers and producers. Markets also thrive with technology and capital. Technology, because this is and capital, because this is how ultimately we'll see a market grow, innovation and investment in, kind